Here is a statement that most people think is accurate, despite decades of evidence to the contrary.
Those who commit domestic violence are overwhelmingly men.
In this video essay, I refute that myth and highlight other examples of gender bias. I argue that when we needlessly perpetuate the stereotypes that men are violent and harm women, and women are peaceful and do not harm men, we get in the way of progress for both sexes. It was back in 2004 when attorney Melody Crick published a 27-page paper in the Seattle University Law Review. The title was Access Denied: The Problem of Abused Men in Washington. She called abused men an important though often secret problem, and in her conclusion she wrote this: for abused men, finding social and legal acceptance is difficult. Despite the fact that Washington's domestic violence law is predominantly gender neutral, traditional stereotypes and time-worn dubious statistics serve to negate the language of gender neutrality. When she wrote that, the stereotyping and dubious statistics were nothing new. It's now 20 years later, and they're still with us. The time has come when leaders and regular citizens alike need to begin insisting that our experts and government officials use unbiased language and present unbiased statistics when discussing the societal problem of domestic violence. We'll look at several examples of the bias, starting with clips from a recent work session on addressing domestic violence from a public health and behavioral health perspective. It involved DV experts speaking with the legislators on the Washington State House Committee on Community Safety, Justice, and Reentry. We'll notice a false narrative that domestic violence is a matter of men mistreating women, and that ending domestic violence means fixing boys and men.
My name is David Martin. I'm the supervisor of the Domestic Violence Unit at the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office.
Senior Deputy Prosecutor David Martin frequently testifies to state lawmakers when they're considering policies around domestic violence. Online and in other testimonies, Mr. Martin identifies himself as someone who helps victims of, quote, gender-based violence, or gender violence.
Victims of gender violence.
Survivors of gender violence.
Survivors of gender violence.
Gender violence, or gender-based violence, is a severely flawed term for our government officials to use as a substitute for domestic violence. We explain why in detail in an article on our website, but essentially gender-based violence is an ideological term with no concrete definition that serves to obscure rather than elucidate. For example, can a man be a victim of gender-based violence? It depends who you ask. Returning to David Martin, he might currently be the most influential person in our state in terms of shaping our lawmakers' perceptions about DV.
Domestic violence remains not just a pervasive and legal and social problem, but a public health crisis, and it demands urgent attention. Those who commit domestic violence are overwhelmingly men.
It's not true that those who commit domestic violence are overwhelmingly men. Mr. Martin's testimony didn't include a data point for us to scrutinize related to that claim, but here's a bibliography that lists 343 scholarly investigations that found women to be as physically aggressive as men in relationships. For those who've never heard of academic findings like that before, here's an illuminating article. It identifies and describes 7 methods people have been using to conceal and distort evidence on the balance or symmetry in partner violence. There are many sources for DV statistics, and depending on which you look at, you can come to somewhat different conclusions. But the conclusion that those who commit domestic violence are overwhelmingly men is not one you can come to fairly. I invite you to read things I've published about DV and to do your own research, but here's one relevant statistic for starters. This graphic is currently on the CDC's website. Just search CDC DV Fast Facts. And it says about 1 in 3 women and about 1 in 4 men report having experienced severe physical violence from an intimate partner in their lifetime. What is severe physical violence? Its definition includes hitting with a fist or something hard, kicking, pulling hair, slamming a person against something, and hurting by choking, beating, burning, or using a knife or gun. This contradicts the idea that those who commit domestic violence are overwhelmingly men. Here are more statistics that refute that myth. In an extensive survey conducted from 2016 to 2017, the CDC found the following numbers of victims of physical violence from an intimate partner in the previous 12 months. Women, 5.6 million victims. Men, 6.5 million victims. Also, let's look at the domestic violence fact sheet for Washington State that's currently on the website of the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. It says 41.4% of women and 31.7% of men experience intimate partner physical violence, rape, or stalking in their lifetime. If these CDC figures are anywhere near true, then it's inappropriate for anyone to frame domestic violence as a matter of men harming women. Maybe you're thinking, well, what if most of those male victims of intimate partner violence are victimized by other males? That is not what's happening. The CDC found that 97% of men who experienced rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner had only female perpetrators. Returning to that work session with legislators and experts, after Mr. Martin spoke, another DV expert testified, Dr. Jacqueline Campbell of the Johns Hopkins School of Nursing. She begins by praising David Martin's testimony.
Everything that was said by David Martin was right on.
She then goes on in her testimony to use language that misleads about who is violent and by implication who is not. She uses gender-specific language when she should be using gender-neutral language.
I developed an instrument called the danger assessment that helps women. So the more we can help women, most women who experience violence from a partner, family violence or domestic violence oftentimes encompasses if a brother is violent toward a sister or a son is violent toward a mom. Many times women want the violence to end.
People have been made so used to thinking of victims as women and offenders as men that they use the kind of exclusionary, marginalizing language that they wouldn't tolerate in other situations. For example, while 95% of US military deaths are men, when speaking publicly about our fallen soldiers, we rightly acknowledge the men and women who died. Returning again to our lawmakers and experts, we hear more examples of language that makes it sound like the problem is boys and men. Here's State Representative Jenny Graham.
It's not just guns. It's, they use knives. They strangle these women. How do we teach our sons to respect girls, and how do we teach the girls that abuse towards you is not love?
That is a biased framing of the responsibility adults have. The question should be, how do we teach children to not abuse others and to not tolerate abuse? Representative Graham's slanted framing of the question is, though, a fitting segue into Ward Urian, who's the last speaker I'll highlight at that legislative work session on domestic violence. Ward Urian is with the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. He co-founded Team Up Washington, which promotes the use of two unfortunately gender-biased curriculums in our high schools, coaching boys into men for boys and athletes as leaders for girls. I've written 4 articles explaining what these well-intentioned programs get wrong. Reading a couple of the headlines, Coaching Boys into Men curriculum used in Washington high schools has major blind spot, and these 7 graphics reveal serious bias in Team Up Washington's youth programs. Knowing Mr. Urian's record of bias, I wasn't surprised that in his testimony he went here.
We need to look at other mechanisms of engaging men in this work. You know what? It's not cool to be violent. It's not okay for you to use coercive control to get the sex that you want.
You can see the one-sided pinning of blame, but let's look at more findings from the CDC. In 2019, among American high school students, 1 out of 11 girls and 1 out of 14 boys reported experiencing physical dating violence in the previous year. The CDC also says over half of women and almost 1 in 3 men have experienced sexual violence involving physical contact during their lifetime. Yet in Washington, you won't find legislators or established experts lecturing women and girls like Mr. Urian does, nor should they. A gender-inclusive approach is the right one. But still, even in 2024, the message so often continues to be, boys and men treat people better. Girls and women insist on being treated better. We must be fair to David Martin, Ward Urian, and others whose careers in, for example, prosecuting attorneys' offices have exposed them to a particularly despicable subset of domestic violence. If I were in their shoes, I might speak about DV the same way. And yet, their life experiences do not make it objectively true in King County, Washington State, or across the United States that those who commit DV are overwhelmingly men. Now, I'm not arguing that heterosexual males are the only victim group that's being marginalized when it comes to domestic violence. The current version of Washington's Domestic Violence Bench Guide for Judicial Officers has an appendix about LGBTQ relationships, which says, most experts agree that domestic violence in lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer relationships occurs with the same frequency and severity as in heterosexual relationships. It also notes that the Federal Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA, did not specifically recognize LGBTQ domestic violence survivors prior to 2013. Statistics given in this appendix include that 24% of gay men and 36% of lesbian women have been a victim of physical violence by an intimate partner. I'm also not arguing that when it comes to domestic violence, males have it worse. If we focus in on intimate partner homicides, for example, a substantial majority are female. This study found over a 10-year period almost 4,000 female victims of intimate partner homicide and over 1,000 male victims. However, domestic violence homicides, while certainly the most shocking and tragic of all DV, are an extremely small percentage of all domestic violence reported to law enforcement and an even smaller percentage of all domestic violence that occurs, period. What I'm arguing is that we need to go gender neutral on this issue and finally put to rest the idea that DV abusers are invariably male and victims are invariably female. Some domestic violence advocates are already getting this right, and others are close. Let's look at an example that shows how close some advocates are. Here's an excerpt from the King County Council's most recent Domestic Violence Awareness Month proclamation.
Whereas 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have experienced some form of physical violence by an intimate partner, and
whereas 1 in 3 teens have experienced some form of abuse in a dating relationship, and nearly half of dating college women report experiencing violent or abusive dating relationships.
Right at the end is where they dropped their inclusivity and marginalized young men by telling a half-truth. They pointed out the 43% of dating college women who, on a survey back in 2010, reported having experienced violent or abusive behavior in a relationship. But they didn't mention the 28% of college men who reported the same thing on the same survey. If we're telling our boys not to abuse girls, and we're not telling our girls not to abuse boys, we're doing a disservice to all our youth. We're prioritizing the well-being and protection of some over others based on sex and gender. This is discrimination. Sadly, our experts are sometimes influenced by an ideology that distorts truth about the relationship between the sexes. This ideology says the problem that needs solving is violence against women, when really, assuming we abhor discrimination, the problem that needs solving is violence. Speaking of ideology, I need to tell you about the organization Futures Without Violence. They created and promote the Coaching Boys into Men curriculum, which I talked about earlier related to Ward Urian and his Team Up Washington organization. Futures Without Violence also promotes and was involved in creating the Athletes as Leaders curriculum. Futures is an ideological feminist organization. That's why a Team Up Washington spokesperson and co-author of the Athletes as Leaders curriculum says that coaching boys into men is meant to
empower the athletes to be role models in the school for consent and respect and equity.
Whereas Athletes as Leaders teaches girls
how to be role models in the school for consent and respect and equity, but also how to create a culture that's more supportive toward girls and women, how to challenge harmful gender stereotypes, and how to speak up for what's right.
This is hypocritical. Those urging us to challenge harmful gender stereotypes and to speak up for what's right are themselves instilling harmful gender stereotypes and not speaking up for what's right regarding an accurate portrayal of domestic violence and relationship abuse. Anyone who's considering involvement with these violence prevention programs should understand that Team Up Washington assumes that boys are prone to being violent toward girls and that girls are prone to being nonviolent. They have a major blind spot. Here's the point. Public messaging about domestic violence that is actually forward-looking needs to expose people to the reality that women and girls are very much capable of violating men and boys are very much capable of being victimized by women and girls. I get that it's uncomfortable conceiving of a female as someone who abuses her male partner. If you want to talk to someone with first-hand experience of what that can look like, talk to me. But we need to get over our discomfort so we can stop marginalizing the many male victims and many female users of violence who all deserve support. Ending DV should not be framed as a matter of teaching boys and men not to harm women and girls, but rather teaching individuals not to harm individuals. More of us need to speak up in defense of what's true. It's time that we put an end to the bias. Experts who promulgate the bias must change if they are to maintain the high regard they're accorded. Organizations that promulgate the bias should have their taxpayer funding reevaluated. People shown in this video may be well-intentioned with their advocacy, but the bias that they and many of their colleagues are perpetuating is doing harm. It's harming males, it's harming females, it's harming children. The bias is hindering progress, it's holding us back. Thanks for watching. In the description are links to many of the articles, studies, and statistics I mentioned in this video. Contact us at info@wibm.us with any questions or comments. And one more thing. The subject I talked about in this video is not Washington Initiative for Boys and Men's be-all, end-all. We advocate for boys and men on issues across the board, including preventing deaths of despair, reducing homelessness and incarceration, bettering educational outcomes, reducing fatherlessness, getting more men into teaching social work and mental health care, and so on.